This lesson is going to cover the art of South and Southeast Asia before the year 1200. This is truly such a vast subject that it might be a bit audacious to think that we could do any more than scratch the surface here with this lesson. But we will do our best and no doubt explore a lot of really fascinating art and stories and music along the way. What we're looking at here is from the great stupa at Sanchi, and it's really probably one of the most famous works of art from the era. We have Yakshi on the right, who represents fertility, the feminine deity, and an elephant on the left there. And we'll look a little bit further at these as we get into the lesson. Let's begin by taking a look at one of the Ashokan pillars. The king Ashoka is both legendary and a real figure from history. The short story about his reign is that he was a mighty king, and he fought many battles. But about 8 years into his reign, he fought a very bloody battle, and it changed him forever. It was horrific. According to his account, over 100,000 people were killed. And he came out of this battle ready to really lay his weapons down and to seek to rule in a manner of kindness, on a moral principle, rather than by conquering his enemies. This served to be quite fruitful and quite productive for Ashoka, and it went on to be an example for how India would be ruled throughout much of her history. One of the things that the king Ashoka left behind was these pillars, and he would carve inscriptions into the pillars to remind those that followed of the moral code. There's about 19 of these left, and they're really located at the heart of his empire. But what's interesting about these is that they're believed to be what we call an axis mundi, or a link between heaven and earth. So these serve as a symbolic reminder of the connection of the infinite with the earthly realm. This region of the world is the home to a vast range of diverse ethnic communities, different language groups, and different cultural traditions. One of the things that connected them, though, is these trade networks. Through trade, pilgrimage, and travel, the three main religions of Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam spread throughout the region, and there were numerous sub-religions, smaller religions. This rich spiritual heritage is really seen in the art and the music and really the stories of the region. We'll be looking at both the Indian subcontinent or the Asian subcontinent, which includes basically the purple on the map, plus Afghanistan. And then we'll also look at Southeast Asia, which is all the orange areas. Let's start by looking in the Indus Valley, which is located in present-day Pakistan and is one of the oldest regions known to be inhabited in South Asia. So the Indus Valley was settled about the same time as Babylon and the Minoan culture, as well as the Old Kingdom in Egypt. Now these are some seals that were found in what's called Harappa, or the Harappan civilization. And I just think these are amazing. First off, because they're so old. They're from about 2500 to 1500 BC. But one thing I want you to notice is the little yogi guy here. See? He's sitting in meditation. And that's from 2500 BC. Also, the animals are pretty anatomically correct. They're really beautiful little works of art from this ancient civilization. One of the best preserved sites from the Harappan civilization is here at Mohenjo-Daro. It's about 50 feet. This whole area that you're looking at is raised up about 50 feet from the surrounding environment. And what we're looking at here is a water tank. It's fairly large, as you can see by the stairs going down into it. And this all dates from about 2000 to 2500 BC. Now, we don't really know the purpose of this tank. It might have been for public bathing, it might have been for a ritual reason, but it remains pretty remarkable when you consider how old it was. Now, these were really a very sophisticated people. They had elaborate water systems, waste drainage, so they were able to support the 20 to 50,000 people that lived in this city at its height. Let's look at one artifact from the Harappan civilization, and that's this little fella. He's about 4 inches tall. But when you think about how old this is and how really well formed this particular artifact is, it's rather amazing. Kind of makes me think of something called Woman of Willendorf, which is quite a bit older, from 15,000 BC in the European. Actually, they were about exactly the same size, these two little figurines, and they both depict male and female torsos. Before we look further, I'd like to talk a little bit about the religious and spiritual background of the area. It was pretty amazing. So about 1500, 1800 BC, the Harappan civilization began to decline, probably because of drought is what we think. Maybe the course of the river shifted, but there was a real dispersing of the cities and the people resumed a nomadic way of life. In about 2000 BC, the Aryans entered India from the Russian steppes, and they brought with them the horse and the chariot and the earliest sacred writings, which are called the Vedas. Now, part of the Vedic tradition is Brahmins, and Brahmins were powerful priests. That tradition has really lasted to this day. But one of the things that happened with the introduction of the Brahmins was we had these religiously sanctioned social classes, hierarchies, so to speak, which became the caste system. So the caste system in India really dates back to 1800, 2000 BC. It's an ancient form. And through the years, it developed into being hereditary. So people were born into castes, and it became very clearly defined. Now, about 800 BC, there was these sacred texts written that took the Vedas even further, and they're called the Upanishads. And the Upanishads say that there's a unity between the individual and the divine, that the material world is really illusory, and that the only thing that's real is the universal divine reality, which they called Brahman. I think it's interesting just to look at these belief systems because you could consider how these are the beliefs that really fueled the societies on the Indian subcontinent for thousands of years and still continue to be dominant there to this day. Although, as we'll see, later on it broke into Hinduism and Islam came in later also. So there was another branch of the Vedic tradition that believed in something called samsara. Now maybe some of us can relate to this. Samsara means endless cycles of birth and death. It's basically doing the same thing over and over in this material reality. And they believed that through prayer and practice that people could eventually be liberated from this cycle of birth and death. Now, along about 400 BC, two great works of literature were written, and these are very important in the East Indian tradition. One of them was the Mahabharata, and that is actually one of the longest works of literature ever made. But the other one that's really fascinating in its longevity is the Ramayana. Now, this is 400 BC, remember? And the Ramayana is still performed to this day. What this is it's an elaborate play that has many, many acts, one after another, and it brings forth these histories of gods and humans. But I've actually seen part of the Ramayana performed, and it's funny. It's really wonderful writing. Very well done. And there's sort of a series of short morality plays that they bring. They have the heroes and the villains, and ultimately they're lessons about right and wrong and living a moral life that are put forth in a form that even a young child could understand them. So it's really a masterful way of taking these sort of abstract, spiritual, and philosophical concepts and making them palatable to the masses. And that's really what the Ramayana and the Mahabharata served to do for the people of India. And they still do to this day. Two other important religious movements around the same time are Jainism and Buddhism. Now, the Jain philosophy is one of nonviolence, and they really preach this philosophy of nonviolence in all things. And while they're not as widely practiced, the Jain religion is not as widely practiced as the big three, it still is a thread that has run throughout Indian history. In addition to Jainism, we have the birth of Buddhism, about 500 BC. According to the legend, the prince Siddhartha left his kingdom and went out alone. And in this night, he had this night where he faced the demons, he faced his inner demons, and he emerged in the morning enlightened. As he traveled the countryside and began to preach on or to speak to people about his experiences and about presence, well, Buddhism was founded. Let's move on and talk about some of the other deities of the time. In all of the farms, the rural communities, and the small towns, there were numerous other gods and goddesses. One of the most widely known was the fertility goddess, Yakshi. And here we have an example that is one of the most famous sculptures from Indian history. She's obviously a fertility goddess, and she's polished to a fine sheen, which is something that we see in the Maurya culture, where she is believed to have come from. She's from about 250 BC, called a female figure holding a fly whisk, but she's a great example of Yakshi. Let's look at some temple structures here. We have the stupa, which is of Buddhist origin, and it's basically a mound of dirt that is usually covered with stone, and people walk around the outside. And then we have the northern style and the southern style temples, often Hindu temples, and they have slightly different stylization, but all three of them reach to the heaven. So here we have this phenomenon that people throughout the world have done, and that is to build these architectural structures that go skyward. It's some kind of an impulse that all humans seem to share. Let's look at the Great Stupa at Sanchi. This is one of the best known early stupas, and a stupa is a Buddhist shrine. This is probably one of the most famous early Buddhist shrine. You can imagine that when it was first built, the stupa mound was made of rubble and dirt, but then they coated it with plaster and shells so that it shone in the sunlight. And around this stupa are these two pathways so the worshippers could circumambulate, and that would be to walk in a clockwise direction. It's sort of a walking meditation. You see this gate here. That was added a little bit later, but there's 4 of them, and they're about 35 feet tall. And they were given as gifts by patrons. And the 4 gates mark the 4 cardinal directions. And I'd like you to look right up here on the gate. Here we have scenes from the life of the Buddha called the Jakarta Tales illustrated. So this is a pretty elaborate illustration. And one of the things that we can see is that when Siddhartha was sneaking out of his kingdom, which he had to do in order to go out and be the Buddha, they say that he had helpers. He had spiritual helpers that lifted his horse and covered the hooves so that you couldn't hear him clomping away. And that's what we see illustrated here as his horse is lifted up and he's leaving. So let's go back again, and I want you to notice right here. You see that right there? Let's look at that up close. That's another of these Yakshi figures, these female figures. And she, unlike the one we saw earlier, she has a little bit more of a form to her. She looks more like a believable form as she holds up this gate. One of the things that the early Indian peoples did that was amazing is they carved temples out of caves. And we're going to look at a few of these examples coming up. Caves had been an important part of the Indian spiritual tradition, really, for thousands of years. But what we see here is a sort of a man-made cave. When you look at this, consider that the ceiling is 46 feet tall, okay? So it's big. and it's all carved out of solid rock. They made two kinds of caves. They built two kinds of caves. Some of them were the monks' quarters, and the Jain monks and the Buddhist monks really lived, they cohabitated, lived side by side. And then they also made these sanctuaries, and that's what we're looking at here. I'd like to compare a couple of different depictions of the Buddha. Now, up until about 100 BC, there are no representations of the Buddha in physical form. So these really represent the idea of what that people had for what the Buddha may have looked like. This is an important image because it shows the influence of Greek and Roman art on the depiction of the Buddha. And that's because of Alexander the Great. He had come through the region about 300 BC, I think 350 BC, and he left his mark. So here we have, it's from the Gandhara tradition in Pakistan. I'd like you to remember that the Gandhara was influenced by Greek and Roman sculpture. On the other hand, let's look at what we see here that makes us know that. Notice how the folds are so well depicted. Notice how you can see a more believable belly, how the face looks a little bit more like an actual human being rather than stylized like we see in the Indian style. So there's the Roman and Greek influence, and here's a more Indian style where yes, he has drapes, but they're more stylized, and we really see this form that's a little bit more abstract. And this shows you the difference between these two styles of art. Notice how this guy is holding up his right hand in sort of a stop position. This is something that's called a mudra. There's various hand symbols, ways of holding your fingers that have important symbolism. There's many of them within this tradition, and let's see, on page 308 they show you and talk about a few of them. Go ahead and read up on that. You'll see these hand positions in various, all of them showing up in the art as we go through this, and when we look at the Chinese and Japanese art also. In the 4th century, we see the expansion of the Gupta people throughout India. And this was a time of great artistic, literary, and mathematical advancement. The Guptas are famous for all of, they had hospitals, they had really elaborate mathematics, and this was when the Hindu religion began to take form. Now, Hinduism is really a collection of several religions, and there's numerous deities. You can read a little bit about it in the textbook. There's a section on that I'd like you to read. Here we have one of the earliest known Hindu temples, and really we're seeing the ruin of the temple. There's not that much left of it, so we can't really tell exactly what it looked like when it was originally built. What we can see is that it's built on what is called a mandala, or a sacred circle. And one kind of interesting architectural feature here is the windows. See, here's a window. We're going to look at a close-up of that window. But what's notable is that it does not let light in, but apparently lets light out because of the story in the artwork. Here we have the Lord Vishnu, who is reclining on the serpent of infinity. See all the heads of the serpent up there? Now at his ankle is his female cohort, and she's gently trying to wake him up. Below we have the 4 attributes of Vishnu, and we have the 2 demons representing the forces of evil. And as he reclines on the serpent of infinity, the Lord Vishnu dreams the world into existence. So this is representation of a creation myth. And it has female and male attributes. It has the forces of good against evil. And these are really aspects that we see in mythology throughout the world. So with the forces of good against evil, with the dreaming of the world into existence, we'll bring part 1 to a close. Thanks for listening.